It was a Tuesday night in late October, the kind of night where the wind howls through the trees like a lost soul, and the rain doesn't just fall, it hammers against the earth with a relentless, icy rhythm that chills you to the bone. And for Officer Mark Reynolds, a 15-year veteran of the Oak Creek Police Department, it was supposed to be the end of a very long, very quiet 12-hour shift patrolling the desolate stretches of Old Mill Road, where the only company usually found was the occasional deer or the static on the radio. Mark was tired, his eyes burning from the glare of oncoming headlights, and his back aching from the worn-out seat of his patrol cruiser. And as he checked the digital clock on the dashboard, which read 11:45 p.m., he was already mentally rehearsing the drive home, the taste of a warm meal, and the comfort of his bed. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for him that night, because as his cruiser rounded a sharp, blind curve near the edge of the deep forest preserve, his headlights cut through the sheets of rain and illuminated something small, motionless, and terrifyingly vulnerable, sitting dead center in the middle of the asphalt. Mark slammed on the brakes, his heart leaping into his throat as the heavy police interceptor skidded on the wet pavement, the tire screeching in protest before coming to a halt just 10 feet away from the object. And as Mark squinted through the windshield, the wipers slapping back and forth, he realized it wasn't a branch or a piece of trash, but a puppy, a golden retriever mix no more than 6 months old, its fur matted with mud and soaked completely through, shivering so violently that Mark could see the tremors from inside the car. Yet despite the blinding lights and the terrifying slide of the vehicle, the puppy didn't run, didn't flinch, and didn't cower, instead locking its large brown eyes directly onto Mark's face with an intensity that sent a shiver down the officer's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Mark turned on his overhead emergency lights, casting a rhythmic blue and red glow against the dark, weeping trees, and stepped out into the storm, the icy rain immediately stinging his face as he shouted over the roar of the wind, "Hey, buddy, move it, you're gonna get killed out here," expecting the dog to bolt at the sound of his voice. But the puppy stood its ground, letting out a sharp, piercing bark that sounded less like a dog's warning and more like a human scream for help, a sound so desperate and filled with anguish that Mark stopped in his tracks, his hand instinctively hovering near his belt, not out of fear, but out of confusion. Mark softened his posture, reaching into his pocket to pull out a small piece of beef jerky he kept for snacks, and slowly approached the shivering animal, whispering, "It's okay, come here, let's get you warm." But as he got within arm's reach, the puppy did something that Mark had never seen in all his years on the force. It lunged forward, not to bite, but to grab the cuff of Mark's uniform pants with its teeth, tugging backwards with all its tiny might, growling a low, frantic rumble, trying to physically drag the 200-pound officer toward the edge of the road, where the pavement dropped off into the dense, pitch-black woods. Mark stumbled, surprised by the strength of the little creature, and laughed nervously, saying, Okay, I get it, you want to play." But the puppy released him, ran 5 yards into the tall grass, stopped, looked back at Mark, and barked again, one loud, demanding woof, before looking deep into the forest and then back at Mark, its body language screaming a message that was impossible to ignore. "Follow me." Mark hesitated, looking at his warm car and then at the dark, forbidding woods where the rain was turning the ground into a swamp, thinking about protocol and safety. But something in the puppy's eyes, a look of almost human intelligence and sheer panic, triggered a gut instinct that Mark had learned to trust over the years, a feeling that this wasn't a game and that walking away now would be a mistake he would regret for the rest of his life. So he grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight, radioed dispatch to say, "Dispatch, this is Unit 4 Alpha. I'm investigating a disturbance near mile marker 8. Show me out of the vehicle," and stepped off the road, following the little golden dog into the darkness. The moment Mark stepped into the tree line, the puppy took off, not at a full sprint, but at a calculated pace, constantly looking over its shoulder to ensure the human was still following, leading him through patches of thorn bushes that tore at Mark's uniform, and down slippery, mud-slicked ravines where Mark had to grab onto tree roots to keep from falling, the rain coming down harder now, turning the woods into a blurring gray wash of noise and shadows. They walked for what felt like a mile, deep into a part of the county that hadn't been hiked or touched in years, and Mark began to worry, his breath coming in heavy white puffs, thinking, "Is this a trap? Is someone luring me out here?" Because ambushes were a real threat in modern policing. But every time he stopped, the puppy would run back, whine pitifully, and lick his hand before darting forward again, driven by a mission that Mark couldn't yet understand. Finally, after 20 minutes of trekking through the storm, the puppy stopped abruptly at the edge of a steep, rocky embankment that dropped down into a swollen, rushing creek, the sound of the water roaring over the stones, and the dog began to pace back and forth along the edge, barking frantically at the darkness below, digging its paws into the mud as if trying to tear the earth apart. Mark caught up, wiping the rain from his eyes, and shone his flashlight beam down into the ravine, expecting to see maybe a trapped animal or a deer, but the light cut through the gloom and landed on something that made Mark's blood run cold, a flash of metallic silver and shattered glass, reflecting the beam of his light. It was a car, a sedan, that had evidently veered off the logging road miles above, crashed through the brush, and tumbled down the embankment, landing upside down, half submerged in the freezing rising water of the creek.
Mark didn't think, he just reacted, sliding down the muddy slope on his backside, tearing his pants, ignoring the bruises as he splashed into the waist-deep freezing water, shouting, "Police, can anyone hear me?" as he waded toward the crushed vehicle. The driver's side was smashed in, but as Mark shone his light into the shattered back window, he saw movement, a tiny hand pressing against the glass, and he realized with a jolt of horror that there was a child inside. Adrenaline flooded his system, giving him the strength to rip the jammed rear door open with a groan of metal, and there, huddled in the dry pocket of the overturned roof, was a little girl no older than 7, clutching a doll, shivering violently, her eyes wide with shock, and next to her in the driver's seat was a woman, unconscious, bleeding from a head wound but breathing shallowly. Mark immediately grabbed his radio, screaming, "Dispatch 1050, major accident. I have 2 victims trapped in a creek bed, deep woods. Request fire and rescue and EMS immediately. Expedite, expedite." And as he worked to cut the seatbelt off the unconscious mother, reassuring the terrifying little girl that she was safe, he looked up to the top of the ravine and saw the puppy, the little golden hero, sitting in the rain, watching silently, its job done, like a guardian angel keeping watch until help arrived. 40 minutes passed before the rescue teams arrived, cut the roof off the car, and hoist the mother and daughter to safety. A chaotic scene of flashing lights, shouting men, and roaring chainsaws, but eventually both were loaded into ambulances, the mother stable but critical, the little girl suffering from hypothermia but alive. And as the adrenaline faded, leaving Mark shaking and exhausted, a paramedic walked up to him and said, "Man, it's a miracle you found them. This ravine is invisible from the road. Nobody would have seen them until spring." To which Mark shook his head and pointed to his patrol car where the muddy puppy was now sleeping on the front seat, wrapped in a blanket, saying, "Don't thank me, thank him. He's the one who found them. He dragged me here." The story should have ended there, a happy ending with a hero dog, but the twist that shocked everyone came the next morning at the hospital. Mark went to visit the woman, whose name was Sarah, and her daughter Emily, to check on their recovery, and after the tearful thanks and the hugs from Sarah's husband who had rushed to the hospital, Mark smiled and said, "You really need to give that dog of yours a steak dinner. He's the smartest animal I've ever met. He saved your lives." But the room went suddenly, chillingly silent, the smile fading from Sarah's face as she looked at her husband and then back at Mark with a confused, slightly frightened expression, whispering, "Officer, we don't have a dog." Mark paused, thinking he misheard, and described the puppy, golden, floppy ears, about 6 months old, and as he described him, the little girl, Emily, sat up in her hospital bed, her eyes lighting up, and said, "That's Buster. Mommy, the policeman found Buster," causing Sarah to burst into tears, shaking her head and saying, "No, honey, that's impossible," before turning to Mark and explaining in a trembling voice, "Officer, Buster was our golden retriever, yes, but Buster died 4 months ago. We buried him in the backyard under the oak tree. We don't have a dog anymore." A heavy silence fell over the room, the kind of silence that makes the hair on your arms stand up, as Mark realized that the puppy currently sitting in the kennel at the police station, the puppy that had waited on the road, refused to move, and led him straight to the hidden crash site of his former owners, was a physical impossibility, or perhaps a miracle. Mark left the hospital room feeling a sense of awe he couldn't explain, drove straight to the station, and walked to the kennel where the puppy was wagging its tail, alive, warm, and very real. And while the rational part of his brain said it was just a stray that looked like their old dog, a coincidence of cosmic proportions, his heart knew that on a dark, rainy Tuesday night, the universe had sent a guardian to ensure that a little girl didn't die in the cold. Mark adopted the dog that day, naming him Hero, and though the family insisted it couldn't be their Buster, every time the little girl, Emily, visited the station, the dog would tackle her with kisses, whining the exact same way he had whined in the woods, proving that loyalty, love, and the bond between a dog and his family is a force that not even death can fully break. A story that shocked the community, went viral across the country, and reminded everyone that sometimes when you are lost in the dark, help comes in the most unexpected forms, begging you to just follow.